Let's continue. When analyzing changes in GDP over time, we need to be aware of the inflationary effects, and we need to take into account the effect of rising prices on our analysis. And let me give you an example. Let's imagine that we've decided to plot GDP data for the British economy. So, for example, these data cover the period for the last couple of decades. Our GDP has grown in this particular way. So it looks like, by looking at the graph, that our GDP has increased from 200 billions to 1,400. So it increased sevenfold. However, the problem is this is so-called nominal GDP. In other words, it's a GDP expressed in current prices. So if we calculate the actual value of GDP produced in a country in a particular year, this is the data which we will get. However, when we try to make meaningful comparisons of GDP figures over time, if we want to compare, for example, standards of living in 2012 compared to, let's say, 1992, we'll need to take inflation into account because prices are rising too during this period. Prices are totally different. And in other words, we need to calculate real GDP, or so-called GDP expressed in constant prices. So we'll try to convert actual GDP data, assuming that prices haven't changed. And this data, this real GDP result, will tell us how exactly the actual production level has increased, because prices are now constant. So all increase in output will actually come from the increase in the actual production. In order to convert nominal GDP data into real GDP data, which do make sense, which are true, correct data which you should use for your analysis, you simply need to divide nominal GDP by price level. So if you will ever have to write a report or write some piece of coursework and you are relying on macroeconomic data, never ever use nominal data for your analysis, because your results will be misleading. Before you will be able to make any comparisons of production level over time, you'll need to convert your data into real values. You'll need to divide your nominal GDP time series into price level time series. Let me give you an example to illustrate this effect. Let's imagine that we are comparing data for two time periods, year 1, for example, 2020, and year 2, for example, next year, 2021. Price level in a country was different. For example, let's imagine that every piece of output which we produce in our economy this year costs £10, and next year prices have doubled and everything costs £20. Just for simplicity, let's imagine that we produce maybe one product, and this product costs 10 or 20 pounds in different year. The actual production level varies as well. For example, this year we produced 100 units, and next year we produced 80 units. Let's calculate our GDP. Nominal GDP. In other words, the actual value of output which we've produced in monetary terms. So this year we've produced 100 units times £10 each. It means that the value of our output is £1,000. Next year we've produced 80 units, £20 each, that's the value. So the total value of our output is 1,600. So what is the change? What is the change in our GDP? What is assumed rate of economic growth, which we can infer from this information? The actual increase in value of our GDP is plus 600, which is actually plus 60%. So it looks like our economy is doing very well. The problem, however, is that this is misleading data. This is an increase in nominal GDP. It's a nominal change in monetary terms. And if you pay attention, you will see that our prices have doubled. They've increased considerably while our production has actually declined. If you look at these changes, you will see that our price level has increased by 100%, while production actually declined by 20%. So what we're experiencing in reality, our production is going down. The actual level of output which our economy is producing is lower, is 20% lower, but nominal GDP data give misleading interpretation of this result. They give us a misleading feeling that we are doing well, which is not the case. What we are in fact experiencing, we are experiencing an increase in inflation. And in order to get rid of this effect, we'll need to calculate real GDP. real GDP data in constant prices. In other words, let's assume that our prices haven't changed. If our prices remain the same, if we would fix our price level at £10, what would be the value of our production? We've produced, this year, we've produced 100 units at a constant price level of £10, so the value of our GDP remains £1,000. This is our base year. We try to recalculate all our time series using this year's data, price level from 2020. And let's now replace our actual price level in next year with £10, with our constant prices. So this is our constant prices. And at constant prices, our 80 units, which we've managed to produce next year, will actually imply that our GDP is now £800. In other words, this information will give us the proper result, and it will show us that our real GDP, actual GDP, has declined by 20%, which is a true representation of what has actually happened. So when you try to calculate real GDP, you are trying to take into account the effect of increasing prices. You incorporate this inflationary effect, and you clear your data from the effect of prices. And if you have the whole time series, as I said, what you need to do, you simply divide nominal GDP by price level data. And if you recalculate your time series for GDP using this technique, you will get the real GDP data, which is now shown in this pink line. And as you will see, our GDP is still increasing during this period, but the rate of increase, the rate of economic growth is much lower. So please be aware of this effect, especially if you do any research or write any report. Otherwise, your data will not make any sense. Next slide. What else you also need to be aware of, or what some other types of data which you can come across in macroeconomic databases? When you're trying to compare macroeconomic performance and living standards in different countries, rather than in different periods, sometimes you can express your GDP using per capita data. You can use this indicator. In other words, GDP per capita is GDP per head, per each person of population. And to calculate this number, you simply divide the total GDP by population size. Why is it important? Because some countries are obviously bigger than others. For example, UK is much bigger than Monaco. Does it really mean that UK has higher standards of living compared to Monaco? Or imagine another country, Russia, for example, or India or China. They are much bigger compared to Monaco, and obviously their GDP will be considerably higher. But does it really mean that Russian citizens or Chinese citizens are actually richer compared to people living in Monaco? No, because the population size is also considerably higher. So in order to make these meaningful comparisons between different countries, especially if you're comparing living standards, you will need to use this GDP per capita data. So simply recalculating the amount of GDP which is produced per each person, or GDP per head. Be aware of this. And another type of GDP data which you can sometimes see is so-called purchasing power parity GDP, which simply means that GDP figures were adjusted to take into account the effect of different prices in different countries. For example, let's say Switzerland or Norway are very expensive. Generally, prices are considerably higher compared to Taiwan, for example. If you want to rent an apartment in Taiwan and in Norway or in Japan, you will obviously pay very different prices. So if you have the fixed income, let's say £1,000, you will feel considerably differently depending on where you live. If you live in a country like China or Taiwan or Vietnam, your £1,000 will stretch to much more compared to if you live in Monaco or Norway. One cup of coffee can cost £1 in Ukraine and £5 in Norway, or dollars. So generally, if you want to compare standards of living, you will need to take into account different price levels in different countries, because obviously different goods cost different amount of money in different countries. And the same income, the same value will actually imply very different standards of living in different countries. So this is what purchasing power parity means. It's simply GDP adjusted to take into account the real purchasing power of this money. Also, another note which I want to make regarding GDP before we proceed to rate of economic growth and short-run economic fluctuations, business cycle, is comparison between GDP and welfare. GDP is used as the main macroeconomic indicator to define or determine or describe standards of living in a country. Sometimes when GDP is increasing, we immediately imply or assume that standards of living have increased as well. So it is an indicator of economic growth and prosperity and increasing welfare. However, in reality, welfare is not directly affected by GDP. GDP, obviously, the income which we produce, which we earn, which we generate, will affect our standards of living and welfare. However, there are many other important factors which contribute to economic welfare, which GDP totally ignores. For example, political freedom. If you live in a free country, apparently you will feel much happier compared to if you live in North Korea, for example, where you don't enjoy any personal freedom at all. GDP doesn't include data on social and cultural development, education, art. It doesn't incorporate what your standards of living which you enjoy due to freedom from fear of violence, war and persecution. It doesn't incorporate quality of the environment or pollution levels or congestion and so on. For example, Chinese economy is developing really quickly. Their rates of economic growth are spectacular. However, pollution level is incredible, especially in large cities. And if you live in a large city, you can enjoy very high income. However, you can suffer from pollution, and you might feel much better off by living to some remote area where your income would be lower, but you will enjoy nature, you will have pollution-free environment, much quieter life, and so on. So your personal welfare does depend on GDP per capita. It does depend on your income. However, income is not everything, and again, you need to be aware of this. GDP does not directly describe welfare of population in a country. So these are the final conclusions, these are the final notes which you need to be aware of. And now we will proceed to the next part of this lecture, is long-term economic growth.